welcome to this week's episode. For those just joining me, I'm Dr. Susan. I'm a board-certified gynecologist and a certified menopause practitioner, dedicating my life for the last 4 years solely to midlife and menopausal wellness. And boy, has it been an adventure of learning. So each of these videos is an attempt to share with you something that I have learned, because you can be darn sure we don't learn any of this in med school. So today I'm kind of bouncing off the topic we talked about recently regarding all of the different types of fat. We were talking about monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, saturated, trans fat. So go back and watch that video if you haven't already. But I'm going to dive a little bit into a related topic regarding cholesterol. So much confusion about cholesterol, and I can tell you what I learned in med school was about zero. We were taught a couple of things. None of these are true, by the way, so please don't repeat them. We were taught your total cholesterol had to be less than 200. Your HDL, high density lipoprotein, was the good guy that had to be as high as possible. And then your LDL, low density lipoprotein, had to be less than 100. And only there was a caveat there. We were told if your LDL was high, that's the bad guy, and your HDL was high, that's the good guy. Well, then it doesn't matter, because they kind of canceled each other out. Have you heard that before? That is complete hogwash. So now we know none of that is true. And I often talk about how science changes, and thank goodness it does, because we're learning more. So, hey, well-meaning people came up with a theory, it sounded good, and then turned out to be not true. And so now we know a lot of different things about cholesterol, and I certainly won't say we know everything because it's an emerging science, but we're learning a lot more about cholesterol, that there isn't good and bad cholesterol. There's actually just one cholesterol, but it's packaged in certain ways that have these names with all of these fancy, confusing letters. And some of those do certain jobs, and some of those do other jobs, and sometimes it can go wonky such that we get buildup in our heart and have a heart attack. So let's talk about that. Okay, so the very basic lipid panel that most doctors still do, and I still do it, it's really insufficient. It doesn't cover much at all. You should still do it, perhaps, but just know it's not the end of the story. It's a very high level, just glossy overview of what's going on. That would be total cholesterol, HDL, high density lipoprotein, triglycerides, and LDL, low density lipoprotein. Now, if all of those are perfect, great. You don't need to look any further. But if any of those are not perfect, we want to dig a little bit further. And let's talk about what we mean by perfect, because this is where some science has changed. First of all, your total cholesterol doesn't much matter, because it can be driven up by any of those things, right? If your total cholesterol is high and you've got a decent mid-range HDL, that might be what's driving it up, not the LDL. So, you can generally ignore the total within reason. It doesn't have to be under 200. I don't really look at that number too much. Now, the most confusing out of all of these is HDL, high density lipoprotein. Used to be called good cholesterol. Remember that? We thought the higher the better. The higher your HDL, the better. In fact, if it's really high, you're just good to go, and doesn't matter what any of the other numbers are. Oh, that's so sad. That was wrong. Some drugs were developed because we were so excited about this idea that elevated HDL, and they didn't work. And it was such a bummer, because we were so excited that we could get a drug that would increase HDL, and that would basically cure the world of heart disease. And there was so much money spent on this because it seemed like such a great idea. It was a massive flop. Not only did it not improve heart disease, but in some of the studies it made it worse. Now, we still don't know everything about HDL. It's a really complicated situation, but think about it this way. Cholesterol is a fat, right? So it won't float in the blood, because the blood is water. So in order for it to be transported around your body, so think about these little particles like postmen going around your body delivering what they're delivering, because we need cholesterol being delivered to every single cell. Cell walls are made of it. We need it. So they're like little soap bubbles with a protein around the outside. That's how I think of them, because when the protein's around the outside, it makes them be able to float around in blood, which is water. So super simplified, but That's how I think about it. So these little packages or mail trucks, like little cars, are floating around your body doing their job. Well, the HDL particular type of particles seem to be largely involved in bringing the cholesterol back to your liver to be excreted in our bowel movements. And that sounds good, right? That's a good job to do, to take it out of our system and then clear it out so we don't develop high cholesterol that could form plaques in our heart. Well, that is good, except that having very high HDL generally means something is wrong. It doesn't mean that you're super great at transporting cholesterol out of your system, because more important than how much HDL you have is how the HDL actually functions. Sometimes you've got tons of it, but it's not working. It doesn't work very well, and we don't have a very good test. They're being developed, but we don't have one yet that's commercially available, for your doctor to draw, that actually looks at HDL function, because that would be much more interesting to know how well it's working. Another possibility is that you can have tons of HDL in your blood because it's literally not attaching to its receptor at all, and it's doing absolutely nothing. It cannot get into the liver in order to get the cholesterol out. So just to say, having very high HDL is not usually a good thing. It means it's just not working. Now, having really low HDL, on the other hand, has been associated with an increased risk of heart disease. So modifying a little bit about what we used to think about HDL. It's not good or bad, it's just doing its job, and sometimes it doesn't work very well. Now, we know that if it's very low, like under 40, that is associated with adverse cardiovascular risk, but having it be significantly high doesn't seem to make a difference, which is a big bummer, because it's always nice if you can create a pill that fixes everything, right? Well, that didn't work. So yes, we don't want HDL to be too low, but being too high is not only not better, but it can actually be problematic. Okay, so we had to swallow those words, and I certainly told lots of people in the past that their HDL of 120 was fantastic, and it actually wasn't. Next one on the list, you'll see triglycerides. Now, typically labs say triglycerides are normal when they're less than 150, but that's really actually way too high. A better level to look at would be less than 100. So for optimal health, we want triglycerides to be less than 100, and triglycerides and HDL do go up and down inverse of each other. So when our HDL is low, our triglycerides go up, and vice versa. When our insulin's high, when we have diabetes or insulin resistance that we've talked a lot about, we see triglycerides go up. So one of the interesting numbers that is quite useful to look at is the ratio of your HDL to your triglycerides, because as you get sicker, if you have insulin resistance, for example, you're going to see that triglycerides go up and HDL goes down. So we actually want that to be 2 to 1. No more than 2 to 1. So for example, if your HDL is 50 and your triglycerides are 100, that's 2 to 1. If your HDL is 40 and your triglycerides are 200, that's 5 to 1. So we want it to be 2 to 1. Sound good? So that's a good way of looking at it, I think, in my opinion. Let's come to LDL. Now that's got a really bad rap. It actually used to be called bad cholesterol. Well, that particular package is built such that it's delivering cholesterol around your body as it should, but it has a particular protein on the outside called ApoB that is really the most interesting of all of these things, because as it's transported through your body, that particular package is the one that can sometimes get stuck in our heart, and that was such a massive oversimplification, but let's just stick with simple for now. More important than measuring your LDL level, which is what the blood test tells you, that simply tells you how much LDL you have in your body. Think about this like mail trucks, as I mentioned my analogy. It's more important to know how many mail trucks are on the road, not how many people are in them, assuming you could have, 5 mail truck drivers in a truck. Unlikely, but let's just go with my analogy. So a more important measurement is how many mail trucks are on the road. Think about it like traffic. There's too much traffic, there's going to be more crashes, right? Not how many people are in those trucks. So when you get your blood drawn for a regular cholesterol test, they're basically telling you how many people are in the trucks. And that doesn't matter nearly as much as how many trucks there are. So what we want is a particle count. We want to know how many there are, not what the concentration is. So think about this bubble, or my mail truck analogy. We want to know how much is in there. You could have lots of bubbles with not much in there, or you could have fewer bubbles with a lot in there. And it turns out that matters. It's actually the particle count that's more important than the concentration, if that makes sense. So how do we count them? Well, that's where ApoB comes in, because every single LDL particle, low density lipoprotein, so this is a package of cholesterol packed in such a way with a protein around the outside called a lipoprotein. Every single one has an ApoB. Now, not only that, but lots of other things that we want to measure have ApoB as well. So if you have an ApoB measurement, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, it's not only telling you how many LDL particles you have, but it's also telling you how many of the other potential bad actors you have, including lots of alphabet soup. There's low density lipoprotein that we talked about. There's something called very low density lipoprotein. There's something called intermediate density lipoprotein. Just a bit confusing. There's another thing called lipo little a. Anyway, all those guys have an ApoB on the outside. So if you have an ApoB measurement, it's telling you way more than just your LDL concentration, which is, maybe relatively useless actually. It's telling you the particle count of all of those guys that could potentially increase your risk of heart disease. So nowadays, you should, and we do in our office, measure an ApoB on everybody, and that's really the number that we look at, much more so than LDL. There are cases where someone could have, for example, a slightly elevated LDL. Let's just make up a scenario. Maybe it's 120, and their ApoB is 75. That's a good number. We really want ApoB to be less than 80 or even less than 60 if you want to be a rock star. There are certain physicians like Peter Attia, who I absolutely love. He wants his to be 30. Well, go Peter, that's wonderful. As low as possible. To do that, usually you've got to take a handful of drugs. Hey, if you want to do that experiment, you can, but generally less than 80 or even less than 60 is going to pose a very low risk of heart disease for the ApoB, because it means you've got not very many of all of those potentially atherogenic, meaning heart disease causing particles in your bloodstream. So ApoB is a critical measurement. Now, generally they track along pretty well together. For example, it would be very unlikely to have a low HDL and a high ApoB. I can't think I've ever seen that in a patient who had a LDL less than 100 and an ApoB over 80. I can't think of somebody who's had that, but I'm sure they exist in the world. That would indicate that even though their LDL's low, they've got a lot of those other guys that are making up the number, because generally LDL is about 90% of that group. So if you're looking at that group of all the alphabet soup, most of it's LDL, and then some of it's the other guys. But so we want them all put together. So very good goal is to have your ApoB as low as possible. Now remember, do not pay any attention to what the lab says is normal. Most labs say the reference range for ApoB is 60 to 120. Now that goes back to what I talk about all the time. Reference ranges are not optimal ranges. They are simply this. They are telling you where most people lie. Most labs use 95% of their clients fall within this range. Well, that is taking a representative sample of the population and just saying this is what they have. That is in no way saying this is what we want to have, because frankly in the population that's not a very high bar to aspire to, right? So you do not want to have an ApoB of 119, which might be read as normal. That's incredibly high. So sometimes on these bell curves, right? A bell curve is an upside down U. Most people are in the middle. Some people are at the bottom. A few people are at the top. There's a few people on each end. That's a bell curve. Some of these reference ranges, we want to be at the lower end of the bell curve, and ApoB is one of those. Some of them we want to be at the higher end of the bell curve. For example, vitamin B12 would be one of those. So we don't want to aspire to be anywhere on the bell curve. We want to be in the optimal range. So number one, make sure when your doctor does a lipid panel that they do an ApoB. ask them to do it. It's a really inexpensive test. I've had some patients say, my doctor wouldn't do it because they said it wasn't covered by insurance or it was expensive. That is just not true. It's not true. And you can get it done very simply. I think if you do an ApoB and pay cash for it, it's something like $40, but it is covered by insurance. It's a standard test. This is like real science, and your insurance company wants to know if you're going to have a heart attack because it's much cheaper to treat it than to take care of you in the ICU. So make sure they do an ApoB. These labs are generally done fasting because we don't want to have just eaten a bunch of cholesterol. That's going to elevate those levels and also elevate your triglycerides. And then look at the number. Do not let them say it's normal. Ask them what is the number, and you want it to be less than 80. So what would you do if it was 81 or 85 or something unremarkably high? Well, I made a video about this not too long ago, what I did, because my ApoB was 95, and that was really annoying and surprising because I have a very clean diet and I exercise, but I am one of those people that is just genetically predisposed to this, clearly, because lifestyle factors did not take care of it. I chose to take red yeast rice. I'm going to put a link to the video about that. Yes, I read the stories about how a bunch of people in Japan died from this supplement. You know what? People die from supplements all the time. Not only in Japan, but in this country too, because you've got to be really careful where you get your supplements. They can be full of all kinds of toxic poison, and that's a very good example. But the Thorne red yeast rice product that I take is absolutely safe. It's batch tested, it's third-party tested, it's free of contaminants. I've never had anyone have any problems with it. And as I mentioned in the last video, it does actually act like a mild statin, and it reduces the production of cholesterol in your liver. So it's remarkably good at lowering LDL and ApoB. And then if it's really high, you probably have to be on a prescription statin to get the most benefit. So ApoB. Now, do not be distracted by people talking about crazy outliers. Remember, anyone can tell this story, right? I remember hearing this when I was a med student. We were talking about how obviously smoking is associated with cancer. That is black and white. We know this, right? We know that smoking is one of the primary best ways that you can shorten your life. Everybody knows that. And then someone will tell a story, well, my grandfather lived to be 110 and he smoked 2 packs a day. That is an outlier. That does not mean that everybody can smoke 2 packs a day and be healthy. So there are outliers, and they just show up all over the place on TikTok and other places. You know, it's human nature to be contrarian, isn't it? So if somebody says having an elevated LDL/ApoB is associated with heart disease, someone's going to pop up and say, well, no, it isn't, because my LDL has been 250 and my heart's clean. So, for example, in the outlier bucket, there's a lot of talk on social media about these lean mass hyper-responders. And yes, I think it's true. I mean, there have been some studies done on this particular group of people who are on a ketogenic diet, super low carb, muscular, athletic people whose LDL cholesterol shoots up really high, yet they are not at risk for heart disease. And I'm just going to put it in the bucket of outliers. Yes, I've had patients come and say, well, I must be one of those. Probably not. This is a rare group of people on a complete ketogenic diet, almost completely no carbs, who lift a bunch of weights. So the diagnosis is made when the LDL shoots up. It's previously been normal, and on this diet it shoots up to over 200, but their triglycerides are normal and their HDL is healthy. So yes, there's a small group of people, and I don't think anyone fully understands why this happens, but don't be drawn into the outliers. That's a very small group of people with a strange response that's curious and exciting and interesting. But what happens often is we tell these curious, exciting, interesting stories as if they're normal, and they probably do not apply to you. Just like the guy who smoked 2 packs of cigarettes and lived to be 110, probably wouldn't happen to you if you tried that. So let's stick in the mainstream here for the majority of us who are not lean mass hyper responders. We're just regular people trying to be as healthy as we can. We do want to have LDL being low. When I made the video about red yeast rice, some of the comments are hilarious. One person said, why would you want to lower your cholesterol? Well, I didn't even answer that question because getting in an argument with somebody who has that point of view is sort of pointless, because I'll tell you why. Thousands of studies have proven that elevated LDL cholesterol, ApoB, and all the other atherogenic particles is associated with an elevated risk of heart disease, and lowering it reduces the risk of heart disease. And there are countless studies that have over and over again proven this to be true. So why are we trying so hard to find a reason why it's not true? I think some things we just accept. And yes, there are outliers. And yes, there are people with high cholesterol who do not have a heart attack. Nothing is 100% causative, but it's one of the major risk factors for heart disease, along with obesity, smoking, being sedentary, not lifting weights. There's other factors as well, but that one is kind of low-hanging fruit because we can measure it and we can correct it. And it doesn't take months of losing weight or going to the gym to do. So let's address the low-hanging fruit. For goodness sake, why not? Okay, so low LDL is a good thing. Same as VLDL, IDL, lipo(a), if you have it, that's a genetic one. And then moderate HDL, having it very high, doesn't seem to help and might actually be problematic. And then we want our triglycerides to be less than 100, primarily because that is an indicator of insulin resistance in most cases. So let's do those things. And what do we need to eat to achieve that? Well, a balanced diet of whole foods. Yes, we can eat some animal fat. We were wrong when we told everyone to get rid of fat. It actually made people sicker because when you get rid of one thing, you often replace it with something worse, like margarine. Trans fat turned out to be terrible. So when we're eliminating something from our diet, the problem is often not that we're eliminating the thing, but what we choose to put back in its place. So keep that in mind. So eat some animal fat in moderate amounts. If you're eating a lot of animal products, we want to reduce the saturated fat that we're eating as much as humanly possible by taking off the skin of the chicken, eating low-fat red meat. That not only reduces calories, but it does reduce cholesterol, and we know that's a good thing long-term. And then we talked last time about the controversy about vegetable oils and so on. I just personally stick to olive oil and avocado oil while everybody's fighting about which one's the best. We know those are good. So lowering sugar, of course, that's good for our cholesterol as well. Not only, but primarily because it helps us to lose weight. And anything that causes us to lose adipose tissue or fat tissue helps our liver not to overreact by producing too much cholesterol. So all of those things are sounding like a broken record, aren't they? Healthy diet, exercise, don't go crazy about anything. Stay in the main lane when it comes to nutrition. Eat stuff that doesn't have a barcode on it, and you will be good. So I hope you learned something today about cholesterol. There's a whole lot more to it than that, but this is basic knowledge that you need when you go to the doctor. Take-home message, know your ApoB number. It needs to be under 80 or even under 60 is better. And don't be afraid of red yeast rice if you take it from a reputable source. That's what I have to say about cholesterol today. I hope you learned something. If you did, please share it with your friends, and I can't wait to see you next week.